All right. And with that, it looks like the recording has begun. So hello, everyone. My name is Jacob Schlosser, and I'm the president of the SLU Law chapter of the Federalist Society. I'm just going to give a quick introduction of the Federalist Society and what we do, and then of our speaker, and then we'll get started. The Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy Studies is a group of conservative and libertarian lawyers, law professors, and law students interested in the current state of the legal order. It is founded on the principles that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of governmental powers is central to our Constitution, and that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judiciary to say what the law is, not what it should be. The Society seeks both to promote an awareness of these principles and to further their application through its activities. And to this end, we have a great speaker for you today to talk to us a little bit about all kinds of ramifications, legal, technological, military, of this new branch of the military we have, the Space Force, and why it is a necessity in the modern world. Our speaker is Professor Daniel Lyons. He's a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on telecommunications and internet regulation. He is also a professor at the Boston College Law School, where he teaches telecommunications, administrative, and cyber law, amongst other courses. Before his career in academia, Professor Lyons was a practicing attorney with firms such as Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. He was also a consultant for Bain and Company. He later clerked for Judge Cynthia Holcomb Hall at the Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. He has been published in numerous legal publications and in the popular press, including for Forbes, U.S. News and World Report, and other sources. He has also been interviewed on Bloomberg Radio, C-SPAN, and Business Radio on Sirius XM, among others. He has his JD from the Harvard Law School and an AB from Harvard College. And with that, Professor Lyons, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Space Force is a fun topic to discuss because it's one of those issues that people have heard a lot about, but they don't have a clear understanding of what it is or why it's gotten so much attention in recent years. I think a number of people kind of put it in the same category of bizarre fixations pushed by President Trump alongside the off-the-wall ideas like buying Greenland or building a moat filled with alligators in the southern border. My goal tonight is to explain why it's a mistake to bucket Space Force with these somewhat more fanciful initiatives. So I want to talk a little bit about what the Space Force is, why it was created, and why the early buzz on it was so negative. And then focus the tail end of my remarks on two competing visions for the future of Space Force. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is the United States Space Force? President Trump ordered the creation of Space Force as the sixth branch of the US military in 2018. Congress approved the proposal in late 2019, and Space Force was established just over a year ago in January 14, 2020. But unlike purchasing Greenland, it wasn't an idea that came out of the blue. Rather, it represents the culmination of 3 decades of debates about how the Defense Department could best incorporate the growing domain of space into military operations. In 1982, the US Air Force established the Air Force Space Command, whose job was to manage its space-related operations. Now, initially, this command focused primarily on missile warning operations, right? Monitoring evidence of ICBM launches and the like, and also on space launch operations, sending Air Force satellites into orbit. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Space Command used space assets to support traditional military operations, most notably during Operation Desert Storm, where Space Command managed satellite communications, environmental and weather monitoring, and crucially, the then revolutionary Global Positioning Satellite System, GPS, which helped with both movement of military assets on the ground during the conflict and also with the precise targeting of military weaponry. Now, Space Command continued to play a role supporting the ground and air forces throughout the global war on terrorism, but there was a growing sense among policymakers and security studies scholars that the Air Force wasn't interested in prioritizing and developing America's space assets. The Air Force seemed much more interested in focusing on traditional air power, right? Specifically the next generation F-22 and the F-35 fighter planes, which were consuming the lion's share of the Air Force's budget and attention. And at the same time, Russia and China were amping up their space operations. So just to give you a sense of what was going on at the time, in 2007, the most glaring sign of this increased capacity came up because it was China successfully launched an anti-missile satellite in order to destroy one of its weather satellites. It's an anti-missile system designed to destroy one of its weather satellites. It was the first successful satellite attempt since the US had conducted a similar test back in 1985. And it came on the heels of two earlier failed attempts in 2005 and 2006. So this put the American military on notice that space was increasingly becoming a theater of operations, a place where the great game between global powers will be played out. So following that missile test, in July of 2008, a congressionally directed independent assessment panel known as the Allard Commission, was named after Senator Allard, who at the time was spearheading the legislation that created it, made the recommendation that America reorganize and consolidate its space assets in order to develop a comprehensive national strategy for space. But unfortunately, the Air Force largely ignored the commission's recommendations. In the meantime, by 2015, Russia had established the Russian Space Forces as one of the three sub-branches of the Russian Aerospace Force. And the same year, China established the People's Liberation Army Strategic Support Force, which was a dedicated unit focusing on cyber and space and electronic warfare as one independent branch of the PLA. And that was just the first round of its announced military reforms. And so we saw a groundswell of frustration within the Air Force because of the Air Force's refusal to take threats in space seriously, and for its continued resistance to reforms such as those suggested by the Allard Commission. This frustration ultimately took the form of a bipartisan bill proposed by Representatives Jim Cooper of Tennessee and Mike Rogers of Alabama, that would have established the Space Force as a separate military service within the Department of the Air Force, with a seat on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The bill passed the House in 2017, but it failed in the Senate. But the following year, President Trump endorsed the idea, and together the White House and Congress worked out the details to establish the Space Force as the 6th Armed Services Branch as part of the 2020 Defense Authorization Bill. So Air Force Space Command effectively was transferred to US Space Force on January 14th, 2020. All right, Professor, cool story, bro, but what does that mean? Right, what exactly is the Space Force and what does it do? So this is the current Defense Department org chart. So underneath the Secretary of Defense, you have 3 different departments: the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. Not shown on this is the Coast Guard, which comes under the Defense Department only during times of war. But the step that the legislation made was effectively this box right here. So the Air Force Space Command was moved out from under the US Air Force, where it had been, and was instead made a co-equal branch of the military, reporting to the Department of the Air Force under the Chief of Space Operations. The current Chief of Space Operations is General John Raymond, who since last month has been part of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, Space Force has basically 3 parts. The biggest part is Space Operations Command. Space Operations Command is what you might consider the warfighting arm of Space Force. It's primarily responsible for space, cyber, and intelligence operations, and it also administers several Space Operations Command bases across the United States and in Greenland. It's headquartered at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado, but there's a satellite position called the Space Ops Command West, which is at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And it's stationed there because that's where a lot of our military space launches occur. Now, Space and Missile Systems Center, that's the second unit of Space Force. That's the Space Force's Development and Acquisition Center. That's headquartered at Los Angeles Air Force Base in El Segundo, California. And then finally, there's a smaller unit called Space Staff. That's the headquarters of Space Force, and that's located within the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. So in essence, what the military has done is taken that old Air Force Space Command structure out from under the US Air Force and instead made it a standalone entity with a voice, at least on paper, equal to those of its sister services. So having explained what it is that Space Force is, the next question is, why did Congress do this, right? Why did Congress think it was so important to establish the Space Force as a new and separate service? So to answer that question, I want to pull on an op-ed written by Terry Virts. Virts is a former Air Force test pilot and a NASA astronaut who spent 200 days on the International Space Station. He's one of only 4 astronauts to have piloted a space shuttle, flew on a Soyuz rocket, conducted a spacewalk, and commanded the International Space Station. And he's also a 30-year veteran of the Air Force, so he knows his way around this topic. Now, when Virts was talking about this, he focused on the idea of joint operations, meaning different branches of the military working together on a military operation. Virts joked that joint operations have been a part of the US military since Washington took the Continental Army across the Delaware River back in 1776. For much of the nation's history, the military has operated, to the extent that there were joint operations, in 2 domains, land and sea. And then during the 20th century, we added a 3rd domain, air power. Now, Virts explains that modern warfare is defined by multi-domain joint operations. Success in a 21st century military conflict involves having a military that can operate in multiple domains to achieve a common goal. But before a joint operation can be carried out, the individual forces need to be organized and trained and equipped. And that's the job of each individual service. They fight as a team, but each has its own unique set of skills and culture and mentality, which is why they have separate organizations. The challenges of projecting power on land, getting boots on the ground and traversing terrain, are different than the challenges involved in projecting power on the ocean, right? Ferrying troops and protecting shipping lanes. That's why we have a separate Army and a Navy. And the Air Force's mission has its own challenges and operations. So these differences in domains require differences in leadership and approach. That's something the Air Force knows well, because appreciating the differences in domains is a key part of the Air Force's own origin story. 100 years ago this past July, Army General Billy Mitchell, who's known today as the father of the Air Force, staged his famous experiment to demonstrate the revolutionary nature of air power. At the time, it had only been about 18 years since the Wright brothers first achieved heavier than air flight. And with the battlefields of World War I trapped in stalemate, trenches and barbed wire, preventing the cavalry from playing its traditional role as the eyes of the army, generals during the war turned to aircraft to fill that necessity. Like every military intervention, the first aircraft were initially used to improve existing practices, right? They were adjuncts to other military forces. Comprised of little more than wood and cloth, these aircraft were used for reconnaissance and observation over long periods, long distances. They were used to provide targeting data for artillery forces. And they were also used to try to communicate with disconnected infantry forces. But for the most part, the armies of World War I viewed aircraft through the lens of their primary domain, land warfare. In other words, they weren't asking, what are aircraft good for? They were asking, how can aircraft make the infantry better? Their tactics and their organization were really centered on how to use aircraft as a tool for the infantry. Now, Billy Mitchell was arguing this was incredibly short-sighted, because tethering aircraft to the infantry and using them just as an adjunct to land power was selling aircraft far short. And to prove his case, Mitchell got permission to and then staged an air attack that sunk the SMS Ostfriesland, which was a World War I battleship that the US Navy received from Germany as a spoil of war. And he did it using only bombs that were dropped from the air. This was, up to that point, thought to be an impossible task. The sinking of the Ostfriesland vindicated Mitchell and other early air power theorists, and really highlighted for the first time in the public eye the promise that air power had. But rather than being seen as a revolutionary hero, Billy Mitchell found himself court-martialed by his colleagues in the Army because of his continued advocacy for air power and the revolutionary nature of air power. It wasn't until 26 years later, and another world war proved Mitchell's thesis conclusively, that the Air Force achieved Billy Mitchell's goal of independence from the Army. And indeed, it's worth noting that the Germans understood Mitchell's point far better than the Western powers. Aircraft played a very important role in the German military's early blitzkrieg successes, particularly on the Western Front in 1940. I would argue that space power is today what air power was a century ago. Right? Like those wood and cloth predecessors, satellites are performing many of the same missions that airplanes performed on the Western Front during World War I: intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, communication. Now, as Matthew Donovan, who was the former acting secretary of the Air Force, noted, those early reconnaissance satellites often even dropped rolls of film for later development, sort of like when early pilots would drop messages scrawled on bits of paper in order to create communication across long distances. But Donovan argued that the nation can't afford to confine itself to viewing space power in the same way that the Air Force's Army forefathers viewed air power, right? Just as extensions of the artillery, observers for the artillery, and then extended artillery itself. It took imaginative and forceful people like Mitchell to help us discover what air power's full potential was. And Donovan argues, and I agree with him, that the same is going to be needed for space. Donovan notes that we're seeing some of the same developments in space power that we once saw in the skies over Europe as air power emerged as a separate domain of warfare. Right? As air power grew more important, it spawned efforts by pilots to deny opponents the use of the air as a space in which to observe the enemy. World War I pilots went from just waving at each other as they flew past to firing revolvers at each other, and then ultimately firing machine guns at each other. The birth of aerial combat demonstrated how militaries would need to target enemy observation and communication systems, particularly those that flew or persisted above their heads. And today we're seeing the exact same experiments playing out in our modern overhead and persistent observers, right? Namely our satellites. Future conflicts, Donovan anticipates, will involve arsenals of anti-satellite missiles like the ones that China deployed in 2007. Could also involve directed energy weapons, cyber attack capabilities, electronic warfare systems, and offensive satellites. Given the advantages that we currently derive from space, right, advantages in reconnaissance, in communications, in global positioning systems, it should be no surprise that those who have their sights on American power would try to deny it the use of this critically important domain. And even if you don't think this is a present threat, the job of the military is to think about and anticipate what the future threats are to American power and move to preempt those threats from occurring. So all of this suggests that space is a place that's wholly distinct from the atmosphere, right? That the area between the land and the atmospheric limit where the Air Force operates. Space is going to require dedicated space professionals to meet those threats, just as the early pioneers of the air needed to be freed from the concepts that shaped two-dimensional warfare in the Army. Now, returning to Wirtz, right, the test pilot turned astronaut, he agrees that while air and space both involve operations above the Earth's surface, they are different domains. What it takes to move, sustain, and operate aircraft is different than what it takes to launch, sustain, and recover spacecraft. The technical skills and equipment required to fly a plane and operate a spacecraft or a satellite are two different skill sets. And the culture and mentality of space operators are very different than those of pilots and aircraft mechanics. And as a result, Wirtz agrees with Donovan that it's a mistake for space operations to be placed under Air Force leadership rather than as a standalone entity. The Air Force is, and it should be, driven by pilots. Air Force leadership and Air Force doctrine is driven by the mission of how do you project air power in the atmosphere immediately above the Earth? And that's exactly what the Air Force's focus should be. Every decision is and should be made with an eye toward maximizing the effectiveness of air forces in the air domain. But that tunnel vision will reveal blind spots when deciding how to pursue operations in the space domain. In Wirtz's words, quote, "In the Air Force, when there's a promotion to selection board, it's often foreign to the pilots on the board when they try to understand what the space operators have done," end quote. So that means that at the margin, most resources and most promotions are going to go to air operations. And space operations is always going to be the redheaded stepchild within the service. This was actually one of the major issues that were Representatives Cooper and Rogers highlighted during their campaign to create Space Force. Representative Rogers noted that in 2016, there were 37 Air Force colonels who were selected for promotion to brigadier general, but none of them were from space operations. None of them were from the Air Force's Space Command. Similarly, of the 450 hours that were dedicated to Air Force professional education, only 2 were dedicated to space. A standalone Space Force makes sure that we don't make the same short-sighted mistakes with space power that we made with air power. In other words, that the future of space power doesn't fall through the cracks because it's housed within an organization that's focused instead on air doctrine. Space Force provides the infrastructure to support and unleash the future Billy Mitchells, who have revolutionary rather than evolutionary ideas for how space forces can be harnessed. So just a quick aside, why weren't these points being made more clearly during the period from 2017 to 2019, when the Space Force was a topic of conversation in the public sphere? Because outside of certain military and academic circles, Space Force was largely viewed in a negative light. It was the butt of a number of late night talk show jokes. Now, admittedly, part of that negative association was the idea that Space Force was a Trump vanity project, right? He wanted credit for bringing Star Trek to life, or at least that's the way it was spun. And that's fair. But you should know that part of the reason why the public received the news negatively was that the Air Force itself was silencing voices internally who would have corrected the record and spoken positively about the idea. It's no secret that while Trump was an enthusiastic supporter of Space Force, his Air Force Secretary, Heather Wilson, was adamantly opposed to it. And so was much of Air Force's senior leadership. They saw this as a distraction that had the risk of taking resources away from the Air Force and focusing on something that the Air Force did not see as mission critical. There were elements of the Air Force that were enthusiastic about the idea. In particular, there's a group of scholars at the Space Horizons Task Force, which is a group within the Air Force known as America's Space Think Tank. Now, the task force is stationed at Air University. Air University is billed as the intellectual and leadership development center of the Air Force. It's a place that provides Air Force training and education for mid-career officers and also has taken on itself to be the intellectual thought center for the future of air operations. It's a campus for leading intellectual thought about Air Force doctrine. But although Air University's faculty has promised academic freedom, the Air Force recently confirmed that they were subjected to a secret gag order that prohibited members of the faculty from discussing the Space Force proposal publicly. Now, whatever the origin of that gag order, whether it stemmed from then Secretary Wilson's opposition or whether there was a more benign explanation for it, the effect of the gag order was to tilt public conversation about the Space Force by silencing some of the most knowledgeable proponents of the idea, just as politicians and civilian scholars and comedians were taking pot shots at it. This was incidentally how I got involved with the issue because I was concerned about academic freedom. I published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that criticized the gag order. That was part of a broader movement that led the Air Force to reverse its position and restore a more balanced dialogue to the topic in the public sphere. And that was followed later by passage of the bill in Congress. Okay, so we've gotten over that first hurdle, right? We've established a quasi-independent Space Force as a standalone branch of the military. But so far, all we've really done is unshackle what used to be called Air Force Space Command, right? We took it away from the Air Force and gave it some measure of independence. So what happens next? What's this new Space Force going to look like? That, I think, is the more interesting question. And it's a debate that's playing out right now in the nascent Space Force community. According to the US Space Force Act, Space Force's mission is to, quote, provide freedom of operation for the United States in, from, and to space, and to, quote, provide prompt and sustained space operations. More specifically, the force is charged with protecting the interests of the United States in space, deterring aggression in, from, and to space, and conducting space operations. Now, obviously, that leaves a lot of leeway for interpretation. So with the balance of my time today, I want to sketch out for you the two competing models for the future of Space Force. Now, if you've been following the Space Force saga over the last few months, you would have seen some headlines about a battle over Representative Dan Crenshaw's bill to allow the Space Force to use naval ranks instead of traditional Army or Air Force ranks. So officers in the Space Force would be admirals and captains rather than generals and colonels. Now, the issue got a ton of attention, or at least within my little circle, what counts for a ton of attention, from perhaps America's most famous Space Force captain, William Shatner. In a tweet, Shatner said, "Dear Space Force, I have a question to ask if it's okay. I'm just a nobody here, but I'm wondering, is it true that the commanding officer on board a Space Force ship is designated a colonel and not a captain? Is this up for debate? I think I'd like to debate the issue." Now, somewhat surprisingly, Shatner was invited to debate the issue. And so he wrote a lengthier op-ed, which was published in Military Times. It was quite humorous, and I'll put the link in the chat after my talk. Giving rise to a somewhat humorous endorsement of Crenshaw's proposal and hoping to move Space Force toward naval ranks. And then Military Times published a competing op-ed by some members of the Air Force that were pushing for retention of regular ranks. Now, this seems like a trivial distinction, right? Why would we be fighting over what labels we're going to call people? But underlying this seemingly trivial distinction is a dispute between two competing visions for what the Space Force should be going forward. And here I'm drawing on the work of Professor Brent Zarnick, he's an assistant professor of space power at Air University. So using a naval metaphor, which perhaps indicates which way Zarnick is leaning on this debate, Zarnick describes this as a battle between the brown water and blue water visions of Space Force. The brown water school is best reflected by a retired Air Force General, Lieutenant General Bruce Wright. Wright is the president of the Air Force Association, and of course supports traditional ranks. Wright's vision focuses primarily on what we call cislunar space, the space between Earth and the moon. That would be the space equivalent of the rivers that are patrolled by a brown water navy. Wright argues that the US must, quote, answer the rising threats posed by China and Russia against commercial, military, and intelligence satellites, with unparalleled military capability to deter and, if necessary, defeat enemy threats in space, end quote. Wright identified those Chinese anti-satellite weapons that we discussed earlier as the greatest threat to American space, a projection of American Space Force, because they were developed to take away America's current advantage in space, namely that system of satellites that allows the United States to use space in order to dominate terrestrial combat. Wright argues that the ability to fight concurrently across multiple domains will advantage our defenses and confound adversaries should we ever need to take the offensive. And Wright stresses the interdependence between the Space Force and the Air Force. At one point, he uses the term Space Force Airmen, because his idea of Space Force would be focusing strategically on warfare on Earth. Wright's vision for Space Force is that Space Force exists to protect America's satellites from military threats, so that those satellites in turn can support the Army, Navy, and Air Force and continue to give them a terrestrial combat advantage. Now contrast this to what Zarnik calls the Blue Water Force. The Blue Water Force is outlined by a retired general named Stephen Quast. Quast is focusing on space beyond the moon, the equivalent of what we would have called a blue water navy, right? The oceans, not the rivers. Now, like Wright, Quast identifies China as America's greatest threat in space. However, the space race with China is about determining which values will dominate the future world order, says Quast, not just about securing some terrestrial military advantage. Space, Quast believes, will be a multi-trillion-dollar market. And the first great power to develop the infrastructure to harness the resources of space is going to get an economically dominant position here on Earth. China's anti-satellite weapons concern Quast, but what concerns him more are China's plans to build bases on the moon and on Mars, to develop nuclear-powered space shuttles, and to build space solar power stations by 2040. To Quast, China's rapid technological development, right? Things like hypersonic weapons, 5G wireless internet, artificial intelligence, and other technologies are a far bigger threat than its anti-satellite capability. And further, Quast argues, China is actively pursuing a plan to use space as the ultimate high ground to dominate the global economy and to transform economic, military, and political power in its image. So Quast's Blue Water Space Force would, quote, defend all American interests to include commerce and space, end quote, and would be completely independent from the Air Force in order to ensure that space gets the attention and the focus required to implement a strategy that would secure the American way of life in this century, now I'm using Quast's words, and to ensure the goods and promises offered by space are not dominated by a country disinterested in human freedom, end quote. So the differences between Wright's and Quast's vision for Space Force are stark, and not just in a colonel's versus captain's way. Wright wants an Air Force-like Space Force, right? One that's focused on fighting a great war with China. Quast is thinking more of a Navy-like Space Force, one that helps America compete with China for economic and technological supremacy by projecting power and protecting American space commerce. Wright argues for a satellite combat command. Quast states the need for a more like a frontier defense force. Wright's strategic outlook assumes there's a zero-sum game that's prioritizing what America already has. Quast is envisioning a system where space exploitation expands the pie and America is well positioned to reap the benefits of that through peace and prosperity. Professor Zarnick uses the Thucydides trap to help explain the difference between these two visions. The Thucydides trap refers to the severe structural stress that's caused by a rising power threatening to upend the existing ruling authority. The Thucydides trap is often sprung when a dominant power declares war against a rising power that it fears will otherwise soon overtake it. Now, in our current circumstances, Air Force theorists on both sides see that the United States is being threatened by the rising power of China. In the Thucydides trap framework, Wright's conception, a war-fighting space force, is intended to help win a catastrophic war against China in order to retain America's current dominance. Wright's service would do very little to prevent China from threatening America's position as the world's dominant power. Now, Quast's commerce protecting space force, by comparison, is intended to outcompete China, right? To look for economic, technological, and military dominance through the power of space. So that as a rejuvenated superpower, America is never confronted with the Thucydides trap problem in the first place. Who has the better of this argument? I think it's too early to tell. Quast is certainly correct that China is currently looking beyond killer satellites, right? It's landed an unmanned spacecraft on the far side of the moon. It's made no secret of its ambitions beyond. On the other hand, it has yet to launch a manned spacecraft. Now, Quast is also correct that there's a huge potential for economic development in space, right? That's why Richard Branson and Elon Musk and other private developers are making big bets now on future technologies and capabilities. This includes space tourism, it includes space mining, potentially green energy developed above the atmosphere in ways that don't contribute to global warming. And we can discuss a little bit more about those in the Q&A if you'd like. So there's definitely a potential there, but whether that potential is 10 or 20 years out or more like 50 or 60 years out remains to be seen. If you go back to the New York Times headline in the mid-1910s, as Quast has noted, the New York Times boldly predicted that cross-country or international air travel was at least a century off, if not more. Of course, that proved to be wildly pessimistic. Quast is betting that the same is true of the naysayers who doubt exploiting space as something happening in the near future. In other words, he thinks that space exploitation is sooner rather than later, and we need to be best positioned so that Americans and not Chinese industry is the first mover in that area. Whatever the future holds, I'm certain that more now than I was at the beginning of the Space Force dialogue, that establishing Space Force as an independent agency was the first right step. So that's all I have. I'm happy to take questions.
Anyone who has questions can use the raise hand function or talk to us in the chat, and I can kind of go through those questions and talk to Professor Lyons about your questions. I did have a couple to start off with as you guys are working on those. The first was kind of picking up right where you left off with Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, Blue Horizons, those sort of groups. How do you see this happening? Because as you're talking about this blue water idea of what Space Force is going to be, I'm getting history class flashbacks to, say, joint stock companies and weird half governmental, half private enterprises. How do you see that like growth of especially space industry, not necessarily space commerce, or rather space tourism going?
Yeah, I think space tourism is the lowest hanging fruit in the space ecosystem. I think there's a number of people with disposable income who are happy to shed some of that disposable income for the chance to do what so far only a few hundred astronauts have ever successfully done, right? To be weightless in space. If you'd asked me this 15 years ago, I would have said there's very little chance of this type of project getting off the ground without significant public-private partnership because launch costs were just too great. And indeed, even America has abandoned public launching. We've been free riding on the Russians for almost 2 decades rather than footing our own bill. But the success that Musk has had with private launches and the race to additional competition in this sphere shows me that technology is advancing very quickly. And if you study the cost curves on new industries, you'd see that the cost a pound of payload to get into space is coming down dramatically, and I think it's going to fall at a much greater rate as those projects pick up and gain in velocity. I think you'll first see private space travel missions be something that only the really rich can afford. But as is often the case with other technologies, the rich become the first movers and provide the seed capital by which someone else figures out how to bring the cost curve down even lower and make it available to the masses. The question then becomes, once we've reduced payload costs, right? If we can get the costs down to a more economic level to get goods and services into space, what's the limit on that? I think just as the rich end up driving a mass market space tourism product, the space tourism product then becomes the engine that drives space industry because it unlocks the technology that allows us to get into space in a more economical fashion. That would lead to things like mining near Earth asteroids, right? Or putting up satellites that do more than our current satellites now. One of the proposals that Quas is really excited about is satellites with massive solar panels that can gather tremendous amounts of energy and then beam it down to Earth in a way that doesn't consume a lot of land the way our current solar panels do, but also doesn't consume and release carbon into the atmosphere because it's above the atmosphere and it's not burning carbon. I think that's just the tip of the iceberg as to what may be possible moving forward.
Thank you for that. It sounds like there's a lot that's kind of on the horizon, and it's just a question of how soon and how much capital can be sort of put into it from even outside of government sources. I had a question from outside the chat, but now that we're in the Biden administration, is there a perception that Space Force as a Trump administration initiative may have some backward momentum, or at least a lack of forward momentum? What's the momentum for the growth of Space Force or the operational capacity of Space Force like in the near term?
Yeah, I think for proponents of Space Force, it was really important to get it set up before the end of the Trump administration, precisely because of that, because there are still elements of the Air Force that are adamantly opposed to this idea, and I think would have found ready allies in the new Biden administration to try to undermine the progress that was made. That having been said, bureaucracies tend to stick around, right? Once something is created, it's very hard to make it go away. So I think the fact that Space Force is now standing, I mean, it's still subordinate to the Department of the Air Force, but it's not under the United States Air Force. It's now an independent standalone entity, is going to make it a lot harder for it to retrench. Will it continue to grow? I think it's not as likely as if you had seen a second Trump administration, right? And we're beginning to see that in Biden's approach to other space initiatives, most importantly, the Artemis Accords, which is the long-term plan to return to the moon, which had been a Trump priority initiative and is obviously getting less attention, at least that's the early indications from the Biden administration. So I think you're less likely to see a big push in Space Force, much more incremental growth. But I don't think we're likely to see a retrenchment, a moving backwards under Biden. I think because if nothing else, that would require another round of congressional legislation, and Space Force has enough friends in Congress, a Congress that just passed Space Force's enabling legislation, that I don't think they're likely to reverse it very soon. So Space Force is here to stay, although what here looks like in 4 years remains to be seen.
Thank you, Professor. Picking up on the Biden administration. The new commander-in-chief has done a lot in the first couple of days of his administration to reconnect in a stronger way to the international community. He's re-signed the Paris Climate Accord. He's said we're back to full running capacity with the WHO, and seems to be building closer connections in the UN. I was concerned at the very beginning of Space Force if it was sort of grounded, dead on arrival, because of international accords, treaties and such, saying space cannot be militarized. End of discussion. So where do you see those going? And am I misinterpreting what the current international scheme around space is?
That's a good question. So there, what we know is is forbidden, what's arguably forbidden, and then what's allowed. So it's clear that the treaties that we have signed that we're a party to prohibit the use of deployment of nuclear weapons in space. And there's no plans, as far as I'm aware, for Space Force to develop a space-mounted nuclear capacity that would be in violation of those treaties. There is questionably a UN treaty that prevents the militarization of space. I'm not 100% sure on this. My understanding is the US government's position is that it does not prohibit the deployment of conventional forces in space. We were, until the 1980s, a party to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which would have prohibited some conventional forces in space, but we pulled out of that as part of President Reagan's Star Wars initiative, which the US military position has always been, once we pulled out of the ABM treaty, we were unshackled from any international law restrictions on deploying conventional weapons in space. That having been said, most of the talk with regard to Space Force, and rightfully so, is defensive, not offensive in nature, and designed to promote the peaceful development of space, right? Our goal should be the maintenance of peaceful relations in space and deploying weaponry that is only going to protect our existing assets, not offensive weaponry. We haven't engaged in the type of anti-satellite attacks that China engaged in 2007 and that we saw with India more recently, in part because blowing up satellites creates space debris, and space debris makes it a lot harder for our existing satellites to operate because there's a greater chance they're going to run into something and be damaged. But also because it cuts against our overall goal of peace. When you're the dominant player, peace is what you want, right? Because it's only through conflict that you run the risk of losing your current position.
Had another question concerning, we talked a little bit more about the blue water paradigm. And under the brown water paradigm, is that where you're seeing most of the naysayers? Are people functioning under more of the people who don't like the idea of a Space Force? It's redundant. I read a couple articles from Senator Mark Kelly, former astronaut, and has that same sort of background as, I can't remember who you mentioned, but one of the experts who's been saying it's a great idea. Is that brown water paradigm what's causing people to say this is super redundant and not necessary?
Yeah, so I think Senator Kelly reflects the view of the Air Force establishment, which is largely that the only thing Space Force does is provide satellite eyeballs for the Air Force and for the ground forces. And to create it to create a standalone entity and make it think about something more than just an adjunct to our existing fighting forces runs the risk of diverting resources away from the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, particularly the Air Force. I think the Space Force folks have argued quite persuasively in my sense that it's short-sighted to think of Space Force as just an adjunct to our existing forces, the same way that I think it was short-sighted to think of air power as just another way to do artillery spotting. But like Billy Mitchell, right, the current proponents of Space Force are running into some difficulties because you can't predict the future. You can't predict innovation with certainty. You can say, I know the world is going to change, but I can't tell you right now exactly how it's going to change. And so it makes it easy for pessimists to argue, no, the world is not going to change. Right? If that was the, that because you can't tell me exactly what the future holds, it's a mistake to plan for the future as opposed to planning for the present. That's the kind of mindset that kept us locked into, for example, the Bell telephone monopoly for 80 years. And it was only when unleashing us from wireline that we got cell phones, smartphones, and then ultimately the internet. Once we began saying, hey, what is possible? And maybe we'll loosen the restrictions and allow folks to experiment and throw a bunch of stuff against the wall and see what sticks.
Thank you, Professor. I see a question with the raise hand function. Alyssa?
Hi there. Professor, thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. I am by no means a military historian or anything, but to me it seems really counterintuitive to set up a defense program when the goal is for peaceful space relations. Mm-hmm. And I realized that NASA's development at the same time that the Cold War was going on has its own problematic implications with regard to, the purpose of space travel, right? And with NASA's, defunding and last shuttle going up in 2011, and the subsequent privatization of space travel through SpaceX and Boeing, I'm at the point where I wonder what the point of all of this is. You make allusions to the sort of Blue River analogy and the idea of finding green sources of energy on a planet that we're pretty much destroying and at a point of destruction, the sort of capitalization of space and everything like that. I fail to see the point of this. And I'm wondering if you can maybe rectify any sort of positive that could come out of this. It seems like a massive waste of military funding to prepare a defensive mechanism for something that it doesn't even seem like there's a real threat for within this world that we're living in right now.
Sure. So just to put it into context, Space Force is by far the smallest of the 6 military services. Now, it's not to say its budget is minuscule, right? It's dealing with some very expensive technology. But the amount that we're projected to be spending on Space Force is not nearly what we're spending on Army, Navy, Air Force, things like that. I think there are a few people who would suggest that we shouldn't engage in any operations in space at all. And part of the reason why I say that is because we have assets in space that are what we consider dual use assets, right? The global positioning system, which was developed originally for the military, now is in every smartphone in the country, in the world. And we have a tremendous private use for it. Communication satellites, right? The satellites that provide a video service and internet access in places that can't be reached. There are a wide range of private developments or public-private developments that are already taking place in space. And if we were in a position where we thought none of those ever face any threat, then there wouldn't be any need for a Space Force. But they do face some threat, right? Not just the anti-satellite capabilities that I discussed earlier, but more benign threats like space junk. There's a lot of space junk that's floating up there. If you take a moment, Google space junk, you'll see that there's like a ring around the United States right now of just debris. And so if nothing else, we need some type of air traffic control system that's monitoring all this debris and making sure that the SpaceX satellite or the DirecTV satellite that's beaming doesn't run into an old astronaut hammer and boom, you lose $400 million. That's one of the things that Space Force is doing, right? So there's a role for it. The question is, how big is that role going to be? Is it just going to be protecting satellites right now? Or should it also be thinking about what the next big step is in space and how do we protect against that? I'm not sure I buy Quast's theory about where space is going to go, But if you're an environmentalist, QUAST actually has a pretty great vision of the future, right? It's a vision of the future that should make progressives really happy, because you're not only drawing energy from cislunar satellites, but you're mining near Earth asteroids rather than digging up the Earth for rare earth minerals that we need in order to power the information technology revolution. So creating those quasi-industrial activities out in space rather than on Earth is actually, I think, beneficial for helping our planet to heal a little bit. Now, we're still a ways off from that, but it's a nice vision.
Thank you, Professor. I think we have time for one more question here. I've got one that is about areas of the law. What areas of the law do you think will be most impacted by the evolution of the Space Force, whether it evolves sort of in the QUAS dynamic or in a more sort of groundwater dynamic? How is that going to change the shape of the law on the Earth?
Yeah, the two main areas of law that I think are going to change are mostly what you had described a little bit earlier, Jacob, right? International agreements on the use of space and military budgets, right? Military reorganization here on Earth. The latter, I think, is pretty straightforward, right? How many resources is the U.S. government going to dedicate to Space Force and what it's going to do? That's relatively trivial, I think, from a legal perspective. The more interesting question is how we're going to shape the future of international law in space. Historically, our international law has been defined in a paradigm where only governments can afford to act in space, right? So there are agreements among countries that are focused primarily on not using, particularly during the Cold War, right? Not using space as a place for squaring off one against another. As the universe, sorry, pardon the pun, as the universe of space actors expands, right? And you get the Bransons and the Musks and the SpaceXs of the world getting involved. Now you have to consider for the first time, what are going to be the rights and responsibilities of private actors in space, right? How do we safeguard space citizenship? How do we determine ownership of material grabbed in space? How do we safeguard space shipping lanes against the equivalent of piracy? Those, I think, raise, we have terrestrial analogs, but we don't have law to create that governs that area yet. So much like cyber law has caused us to think about what are the activities that we do offline and should the laws change as they move online? Right? Should we apply the same laws offline that we do online, or do we need a totally different regime because this is happening in cyberspace? We're going to need to have a similar discussion about what laws govern different activities here on Earth, and should we have the same legal framework operating in space, or do we need a different framework altogether?
All right, and I think that is an excellent way to wrap things up. Professor, thank you so much for your time today and your expertise. And I'd like to thank everyone on the call for calling in and for your excellent questions also. If you have other questions for us, you can email us or look at our social media. Most of that would be Federalist Society at SLU.edu. And then also Professor Lyons at either AEI, which is the American Enterprise Institute, or at Boston College. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you very much.